1789 in France, a year of strife, anguish, social and political upheaval, and general misery. What a wonderful time to be alive. In this video, I will tackle my biggest challenge yet, trying to accurately pronounce French names. But, more importantly, we will discuss perhaps the single most important revolution in European history. This is the French Revolution Simplified. The Kingdom of France had been ruled for centuries under a regime of monarchy, aristocrats, and the church. There was a huge social divide between the wealthy and powerful clergy and nobility and the working people. 18th century Europe was seeing a growth in colonialism, and with many powers trying to come out on top, France was under a ton of pressure. France was also suffering from a series of crop failures, and so the entire working class was starving while the nobility were just kind of partying around. It was also unfortunate that the same people that were partying also happened to be exempt from many of the extreme taxes that were implemented on the poorer classes. Not to mention the many wars, including aiding the American Revolution against the British, had bankrupted the government, but they weren't really wanting to do anything about it. However, facing increasing pressure, in 1787, King Louis XVI called together the upper classes and the Assembly of Notables to address the growing French financial crisis. But it was kind of ineffective, which was not very surprising as Louis himself was pretty ineffective. He was often quick to back down from a decision and was pretty out of touch with the French people, as all he wanted to do was party in his palace in Versailles. The Age of Enlightenment had seen a lot of forward thinking in science and philosophy, seeking to question tradition and faith using science with an importance of freedom of thought and freedom of speech. These thoughts spread throughout the lower classes, and many began questioning the king's right to rule. So, wanting to calm down these anti-king thoughts, Louis proposed to tax the nobles, but the Assembly of Notables, mostly made up of nobles, were kind of like, no. They claimed Louis needed to bring together the Estates General, which was a general assembly of the three estates of France. These were the clergy, the notables, and the common people. And the next summer, they gathered in Versailles. What was anticipated by the crown and nobility to be a rather straightforward discussion of financial reforms quickly turned into dangerous discussions of fundamental constitutional changes, something the ruling class wasn't exactly interested in entertaining, because, well, they were the ruling class. The clergy and the nobility also wanted one vote per estate, giving them a 2-to-1 advantage over the much bigger third estate of the common people. The third estate obviously wanted to vote per person, giving them the much bigger number and being much more democratic, but the first two estates couldn't agree to this. However, the third estate took things into their own hands and began meeting independently of the Estates General in what became the National Assembly. The National Assembly was to represent the people, not the estates, which King Louis did not like at all. Really didn't like. He didn't like it so much that he closed the meeting room for what she described as official reasons and barred the National Assembly from meeting anymore. So, naturally, they did what any rational person would do. The National Assembly went to a nearby tennis court and decided to meet there. Here, they swore not to separate until they'd come up with a fair constitution for France. When Louis heard about this, he wasn't very happy. So he commanded the royal guard to forcibly break up these meetings. However, back in the city, the commoners began to gather, determined to protect the Third Assembly at all costs. Louis then ordered a highly trained unit of the French army to open fire on the mob. However, heavily outnumbered, they were like, no thanks. So they sat aside and watched as the angry protesters, almost 1,000 strong, attacked the utmost symbol of absolute monarchy in France. This, of course, was the armory/fortress/castle thing called the Bastille. The storming of the Bastille is really the event that kicked off the revolution, and it's one of the most famous events in French history. But back to the mob. The governor of the Bastille ordered a ceasefire, but that didn't stop the protesters from giving him a very friendly welcome. This was, of course, beating, stabbing, and decapitating him with a saw, and then parading his head around the city atop a pike. Next, they killed the city mayor, and the riots continued. The very frightened King Louis then appointed the famed Marquis de Lafayette as a commander in the Royal French forces, and he helped many of the nobility as they fled to neighboring countries because, they were facing just a little bit of animosity. On August 26, 1789, the National Assembly finally published a fledgling constitution. Some of its main ideas included the abolition of feudalism, the end of the relentless taxation on the poor, giving more freedom and equality to the people, but importantly, the Constitution left out women. And so, angered by this, they marched on Versailles in protest and the next day stormed the palace and killed several guards. This became known as the 1789 Women's March on Versailles, and it forced the National Assembly back to the drawing board. King Louis and the clergy didn't mind this because the Constitution had also stripped them of their power, but lacking the command of much of the military, they just kind of had to sit tight and wait. Social order continued to fall, with the common folk still suffering from food shortages and anger at the National Assembly and their slow progress, because it turns out it's hard to be patient for political reform when you're literally starving to death. The French Revolution heard you liked political divisions, so it put some divisions on its already existing divisions, and from fall 1789 to spring 1791, a nice complicated divided mess had sprouted from the revolution, as certain political groups opposed or supported the revolution, and fractures within those groups thought the revolution too extreme or not extreme enough, but simply, there was lots of yelling and screaming at each other with the occasional beheading. During this time, King Louis, who was currently in timeout and house arrest and wanting to reassert his power, attempted to sneak away from the palace in disguise and possibly seek refuge in Austria. But unfortunately for him, he still wanted to ride in his royal caravan, and so was recognized and captured almost instantly, along with his wife, the famed Marie Antoinette. Back at the National Assembly, things weren't going very well. Many of those there had seen the American Revolution and were like, so why do we need a king? They wanted to kill Louis and set up a democratic government. But the opposition to this stemmed from the reason that if they did kill Louis, many powerful countries would see an opening and probably invade France, hoping to establish their own monarchy. So the convention did the most rational thing they could do. They played the old switcheroo and basically said, we're going to invade you before you invade us. So they, in April of 1792, declared war on both Prussia and Austria, who they believed harbored anti-revolution ideals. That same month, the infamous guillotine saw its first use, and the commoners, quite liking this new form of entertainment, began to use it a lot on certain individuals. A few months later, a massive crowd of protesters stormed the Tuileries Palace and captured the king and queen. On January 17, 1793, King Louis XVI, the last king of France, was sentenced to death by a guillotine, along with his wife, Marie Antoinette, who was famously and inaccurately quoted as saying, "Let them eat cake." The next day, the National Assembly renamed themselves the French First Republic. And 9 months later, following the Louis XVI's execution, things settled down and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, not really. The multiple wars with Prussia and Austria, as well as power fractures and divisions within the National Assembly, and the continued food shortages had a dramatic impact on the fledgling government. And following the Revolution of June 1793, the Jacobins, a more radical group of revolutionaries, seized control of the National Convention and implemented some extreme changes. They also attempted to completely end anti-revolutionary sympathies, and the French Revolution entered the appropriately named Reign of Terror, the most brutal period of the revolution to date. The Reign of Terror turned from hunting and executing anti-revolutionaries into lots of grudge settling and personal vengeance. During the time span of around 10 months, the Reign of Terror saw an estimated 17,000 people executed mostly by beheading, with thousands of others dying in prisons without trial. Maximilien Robespierre, leader of the feared Committee of Public Safety, personally ordered and oversaw many of the executions until his own execution in July of 1794. It also turns out something called the Reign of Terror isn't exactly popular with the public, and eventually they revolted against the extreme measures taken, and many of the Jacobins were hunted down and killed in revenge for actions taken during the previous months. During this time, the new French Constitution continued to be reformed, and many changes were initiated, and things got even more confusing. Luckily, there was a new player on the stage to clear things up for us. This was, of course, the infamous, the one, the only, Napoleon Bonaparte. And this would begin the Napoleonic era in Europe. But that, my friends, is a video for another day. So until then, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe and comment, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.